The candles at Hollowmere Hall had been lit since 4 o'clock, 12 of them down the long oak table, throwing gold light across crystal glasses that had belonged to 3 generations of vain brides before Linnea. Outside, the moor wind pressed against the leaded windows like something trying to get in, and inside, 6 guests in silk and starched collars waited for the soup course with the particular patience of people who had learned that dinners at Hollowmere moved at the Duke's pace and no one else's. Linnea Vane sat at the foot of the table in pale grey satin, her spoon untouched, watching her husband the way she had learned to watch storms as a girl in Esterfield, not with fear exactly, but with the alert stillness of someone deciding whether it was safe to move yet. Duke Garrick Vane sat at the head, his face carved from the same grey stone as the chimneys above him, answering a guest's question about the harvest with 3 clipped words and nothing more. He had not looked at her once since the first course. She had noticed these past weeks small cracks in the house's careful composure. A patched corner of the dining room carpet turned toward the wall. A footman let go without explanation. The unused west wing locked since winter. She had asked Mrs. Pruitt about it once and received only a tightened mouth and a change of subject. Tonight, with wine loosening the guests and candlelight softening even the Duke's stone face, she decided she would not be put off a second time. She had spent the entire afternoon rehearsing how she might raise it gently, privately, after the guests had gone, and had told herself, walking down to dinner in her pale grey satin, that patience had served her well enough so far and would serve her a little longer yet. It was only when she watched Edmund lean toward the Duke and murmur something about Hobbs' name with a small, satisfied smile that her resolve to wait quietly dissolved entirely, replaced by something hotter and far less patient than anything she had felt since her wedding day. "You dismissed Mr. Hobb," she said, setting down her spoon. Her voice did not shake. She had spent 3 months practicing not shaking. "He kept these accounts since before you were born, Garrick. I have only ever asked you why, and you have only ever changed the subject." The table went still. Lord Edmund Vane, the Duke's cousin, lowered his wineglass slowly, his face arranging itself into an expression of polite concern that did not quite reach his eyes. He had been watching this marriage the way a man watches a fire he laid the kindling for himself, patient, certain of where the flames would eventually travel. "Linnea." Garrick's voice was quiet. Quiet, she had learned in 5 months of marriage, was far more dangerous than loud. "This is not the evening for household business." "It is never the evening, Garrick. There has not been an evening in 5 months. She heard her own voice rising and did not stop it. "I am your wife. I manage this household every day you are not in it, and I am asking you a simple question in front of people who already seem to know the answer better than I do." The Duke set down his glass with exaggerated care, the kind of care that told everyone at the table exactly how close he was to losing it entirely. The candle flames seemed to lean toward him, as if even the fire understood what was coming. "How dare you question me?" he said. "In my own house, in front of my own guests." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled over the table like frost on a window, and Linnea felt every face around her turn carefully away, the practiced skill of people who had decided instantly and collectively that survival meant pretending nothing had happened at all. She did not look away from him. That, more than the sentence itself, seemed to unsettle the room further. A young bride humiliated at her own table was expected to lower her eyes and dissolve quietly into the tapestry behind her chair. She did none of it. She folded her hands in her lap and said nothing further, because somewhere in the space of that single sentence, something inside her had finished bending. Across the table, Edmund Vane took a slow sip of his wine, and Linnea, watching him over the rim of her own untouched glass, saw something flicker behind his careful concern that looked very much like satisfaction. The footman cleared the soup without a word, candlelight wavering on the wide, silver as though even the metal flinched from what it had witnessed. Linnea thought of Wren, upstairs in the nursery, where children dined separately, too far away to have heard her father's voice crack the air like a whip, and was grateful for that single small mercy in an evening that offered no others. When the final course was cleared, the Duke rose first, as custom demanded, and left the dining hall without a backward glance. One of the younger guests, a Mr. Aldridge who had come up from the county to discuss horses and clearly wished he had stayed home, leaned toward his wife and murmured something Linnea did not catch, though the wife's quick, pitying glance in her direction told her plainly enough what had been said. Linnea remained seated a moment longer than necessary, long enough to feel Edmund's gaze settle on her like a hand she had not invited. "He did not mean it as it sounded," Edmund said softly, leaning toward her chair, his voice carrying the practiced gentleness of a man who had learned that comfort offered at exactly the right moment open doors that demands never could. "Did he not?" Linnea said. It was not a question, and she did not wait for his answer. She climbed the staircase to her chambers alone, past the portraits of vain duchesses who had come before her. Composed faces, folded hands, women who had perhaps also sat through dinners that ended in frost and silence. She paused before the portrait nearest her door. The Duke's first wife, Margaret, dead 5 years, and still somehow more present in this house than Linnea had ever managed to be in 5 months of trying. She did not cry. She had promised herself months ago that crying solved nothing in a house built of stone and silence. She thought instead of her own wedding morning, the cold churchyard grass, the 4 silent witnesses, the way Garrick had looked at her exactly twice during the entire ceremony, both times like a man confirming a delivery had arrived intact. She had told herself then that careful politeness was simply how dukes loved, slowly, at a distance. Tonight she understood, with a clarity that hurt more than the insult itself had, that she had been lying to herself for 5 months to make the silence easier to bear. She opened the small writing desk by her window, drew out a single sheet of paper, and beneath the candle's thin light began, for the first time since her wedding day, a list of exactly what she intended to learn and exactly what kind of woman she intended to become before this house finished deciding the answer for her. Outside, the moor wind pressed against the windows of Hollowmere Hall, the same wind that had blown across that land for 400 years, indifferent to every duchess who had come and gone beneath its watch. But something in Linnea Vane had shifted that night the wind could not have predicted, and as she finally set down her pen, she noticed, tucked beneath the blotting paper in the desk drawer, a folded scrap of someone else's handwriting that was certainly not her own, and certainly not the Duke's. She unfolded it slowly. It was a single line, unsigned, written in ink she did not recognize. "Tell no one what the northern fields cost. G must never see the full sum." Her candle guttered low, and for the first time that night, Linnea Vane felt genuinely, completely afraid. 8 months earlier, Linnea Calloway had stood in her father's modest parlor in the market town of Esterfield, holding a letter that smelled faintly of expensive ink and certain disaster. Her father, a wool merchant with kind eyes and steadily worsening luck, had read it twice before he could bring himself to meet her gaze across the worn table between them. "The Duke of Hollowmere has made an offer," he said finally, "for you." Linnea was 22, clever in the particular way that made governesses nervous and suitors scarce, and entirely unprepared for a duke to want anything from her at all. Her family held no title, no land beyond a leased pasture, and debts her father had stopped mentioning aloud months before. A duke did not marry arithmetic like that for love. She set the letter down with hands that did not shake, though everything inside her did. "He does not want a wife in the way you mean it," her father admitted quietly, unable to soften the truth any longer. "He wants a mother for his daughter, and a name no scandal can touch, and a woman who will not embarrass him at court. Your aunt's connection to the old Hollowmere housekeeper made the introduction possible at all. I'm told he was specific in his request. He asked for someone unremarkable." The word landed like a slap, dressed politely as a compliment. Linnea understood immediately what it meant. A duke recovering from a wife's death, and from a year of quiet court gossip about the manner of it, could not risk marrying a second time into more attention. He wanted someone safe, someone forgettable, someone who would manage his household efficiently and never once ask anything of his guarded, locked-away heart. Her father had wept, briefly and privately, the night before the wedding, in a way Linnea had never once seen him do, even when the wool prices collapsed 2 winters running and they had nearly lost the house entirely. "I told myself I was arranging your safety," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'm no longer certain I have not simply arranged your loneliness instead, dressed up in a finer gown than we could otherwise have afforded you." Linnea had taken his hand and told him, with more confidence than she actually felt, that safety was not nothing, and that she intended to find whatever else she needed for herself. She had believed it mostly on her wedding morning. She believed it rather less by the second week at Hollowmere. She married him in March, in a ceremony so quiet it barely felt like a wedding at all. A private chapel, 4 witnesses, frost still silvering the churchyard grass outside. The groom looked at her exactly twice during the entire service, both times with the careful, assessing politeness of a man inspecting a purchase he had already signed for and could no longer return. There had been exactly 1 meeting before the wedding, a stiff half-hour in her father's parlour, during which the Duke had asked her 3 questions: whether she could manage a large household staff, whether she minded the country over the city, and whether she had any objection to raising a child who was not her own. She had answered all 3 honestly, and he had thanked her with the same brisk courtesy he might have shown a tradesman who had quoted a fair price. She had gone to bed that night telling herself that honesty, at least, was a foundation she could build something upon, even if love was never offered as part of the arrangement. Hollowmere Hall, when she first saw it through the carriage window, rose out of the moor fog like something that had grown there rather than been built by human hands. Grey stone, ivy-choked windows, and a silence so complete that her own footsteps on the gravel drive sounded like an intrusion into a place that had not expected to be disturbed again. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, showed her to chambers 2 full corridors from the Duke's own rooms. A distance Linnea understood at once said more about the marriage than any vow exchanged that morning. Mrs. Pruitt had been kind in her own careful, unsentimental way that first evening, lighting extra candles against the unfamiliar dark and leaving a small plate of bread and cheese by the bed in case the new Duchess found herself too nervous to come down for a proper supper. "His Grace keeps to himself," she had said simply, folding back the bed covers. "It is not unkindness exactly. It is just what grief leaves behind when it has nowhere else to go." Linnea had thanked her and said nothing else, but she had turned the words over for a long time in the dark, wondering exactly how much grief a single house could hold before it began to crack. It was Wren who found her first, 3 days after her arrival. A small girl with her father's dark, watchful eyes and a grief far too large for her 6 years appeared silently in the doorway of the morning room, clutching a wooden horse with one ear chewed off, and watched Linnea arrange flowers for nearly 20 minutes without speaking a single word before retreating as quietly as she had come. Mrs. Pruitt had warned her, gently, not to expect much from the child. "She has not spoken more than a handful of words to anyone since the funeral, Your Grace, not even to His Grace himself, though it breaks something in him every time he tries and fails to coax one out of her." Linnea had nodded and said nothing in reply, but privately she had decided, watching the small figure disappear back down the corridor that first afternoon, that she would rather earn 1 real word from that careful, watching child than 100 polite sentences from anyone else in the house. Linnea did not chase her. She had learned, somewhere in her own quiet childhood, that frightened things came closer only on their own time, never on someone else's schedule. The next morning she left a second wooden horse, carved badly by her own unskilled hand the night before, the ears slightly too large and one leg shorter than the others, on the nursery windowsill beside the first. She said nothing about it to anyone in the house. But 3 mornings later, both horses had been moved to stand side by side, facing the same window, as if keeping careful watch together over the moor beyond the glass. It was the first conversation Linnea ever had at Hollowmere Hall that required no words at all, and it taught her something the Duke himself had clearly not yet learned in his own grief: that love in that cold, silent house would have to be built one small, patient offering at a time, by someone willing to wait as long as it took to be trusted. She did not know that the Duke had watched the second horse appear from the corridor one morning, silent and unreadable, his hand resting against the doorframe a moment longer than necessary before he walked on. Nor did she know in those first gentle weeks about the locked west wing, the dismissed footman, or the careful arithmetic Lord Edmund Vane had already begun composing in a study 2 floors below her, with a patience that made her own seem almost reckless by comparison. What she knew, climbing into a cold bed alone that first week, was simpler and harder to name. She had been chosen for being unremarkable. She intended, quietly and on no one's schedule but her own, to prove exactly how wrong that choice had been. The Duke's coldness, Linnea came to understand over the following weeks, was not cruelty so much as armor worn so long it had fused to the skin beneath it. Mrs. Pruitt told her the shape of it in careful fragments, over many quiet afternoons folding linens together, the way servants share truths they are never quite paid to tell. Margaret had died in childbed, and in the fever of those final hours had said something to her husband that no one at Hollowmere would repeat aloud, not even after 5 years. Whatever it was, the Duke had not fully opened his heart to another living soul since. There were nights Linnea heard him pacing the long gallery above her chambers, his footsteps slow and even, stopping always at the same point near what she would later learn was Margaret's old sitting room, locked now and untouched for 5 years. She never once mentioned hearing it. Some griefs, she understood instinctively, were not hers to interrupt, only to wait beside, patiently, until the person carrying them decided on their own that the waiting had gone on long enough. Linnea did not ask him about it directly. She asked him instead about the estate, its tenants, the leaking roof above the east wing that no one seemed in any hurry to repair, despite 3 winters of damage spreading slowly across the ceiling plaster below it. He answered these questions with clipped, sufficient politeness, the careful tone of a man answering a stranger he had met once on a train and hoped never to see again. It was, she told herself most nights, more than nothing. Some nights it did not feel like enough to live on. One evening, hoping to close even a small part of the distance between them, she had brought a tray of tea into his study uninvited and asked gently whether he might tell her something of his own childhood at Hollowmere. He had looked up from his papers with an expression of mild, genuine confusion, as though she had asked him something in a foreign language, and answered only, "There is little worth telling," before returning to his ledgers. She had left the tea on the corner of his desk and walked out without another word, and that small, ordinary rejection had stayed with her longer than she liked to admit. It was Edmund who first mentioned the debt, 3 weeks into her marriage, with the studied casualness of a man dropping a stone into still water purely to watch how far the ripples travelled before anyone noticed who had thrown it. "Surely Garrick has told you about the mortgage on the northern fields," he said over afternoon tea in the small parlour, watching her face with far more attention than the question seemed to warrant. "No. How very like him. He does so hate to trouble a new wife with unpleasant arithmetic so soon into a marriage." He smiled as he said it, a small practiced smile that Linnea would only later learn to recognize as the precise shape Edmund's cruelty always wore when it wished to be mistaken for concern. Linnea said nothing in that moment, but that night she could not sleep at all. The wind found every gap in the old window frames, rattling them softly, and somewhere beneath her feet she could hear the particular silence of a house holding a secret far too heavy for its own foundations to bear quietly forever. She found the ledger almost by accident 3 days later, in the unused West Gallery she had wandered into one grey afternoon out of nothing more than restlessness and curiosity. Dust lay thick over the floorboards there, undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading toward the far wall, and the air smelled faintly of cold stone and old varnish. It was tucked behind a portrait of the second Duchess of Hollowmere, hanging slightly askew on its hook, as though someone had moved it recently and forgotten in their haste to set it perfectly straight again. The numbers inside, written in a hand she would later recognize as Edmund's rather than her husband's careful script, told a story far worse than a leaking roof and a dismissed footman. Loans taken against the northern fields. A second mortgage quietly placed on the timber rights. Payments to a London creditor recurring monthly with the grim, patient regularity of a tide that never once failed to arrive. And beneath all of it, a single chilling note in the same unfamiliar hand. G need not know the full sum. Evie. Linnea closed the ledger slowly. Her hands, she noticed with some surprise, entirely steady despite everything she had. Just read in the fading afternoon light. She had spent her whole brief marriage believing herself unremarkable, a footnote chosen specifically for her quietness and lack of consequence. But quiet women, she was beginning to learn, noticed things that loud, confident women never had cause to look closely enough to see at all. She copied 3 pages into her own careful hand before returning the ledger exactly as she had found it. Behind a portrait whose painted subject, she noted with a flicker of dark and unexpected humor, wore an expression of perfect, untroubled serenity that nothing in this house had earned in years. Her hands trembled only once, refolding the pages into the lining of her sleeve, when she heard footsteps somewhere below in the east corridor and froze entirely still in the grey gallery light, certain for one long-held breath that she had been discovered. The footsteps passed on toward the kitchens without pausing, and she let her breath out slowly, understanding with sudden, unwelcome clarity exactly how much danger she had just chosen to walk into, alone, with no one in this enormous house yet aware that she had done it. She did not confront Edmund that evening, or the next. She did not yet trust herself to fully understand what she was looking at, or who else might be standing quietly in the shadows behind it, watching her watch them in turn. Instead, she sat by her window long after the candle should have been extinguished, turning the copied pages over in her mind, and understood, with a cold and sudden clarity that frightened her more than the numbers themselves, that she was standing at the edge of something enormous, with no one beside her to catch her if the ground gave way. She thought of the note she had found beneath the blotting paper only days before, the warning meant for someone else's eyes entirely. She thought of Hob, dismissed without warning after 3 decades of honest service. And she thought, finally, of her own reflection in the dark glass of the window, a woman who had been chosen precisely because no one expected her to notice anything at all. She thought, too, of the dismissed footman no one would speak of, and wondered, with a cold prickle along her arms, whether he had simply seen too much as well, and paid for it the same quiet way Hob had. How many small, careful dismissals had this house already absorbed, she wondered, before she herself had even arrived to notice the pattern forming beneath them. That night, for the first time since her wedding, Linnea did not feel unremarkable in the slightest. She felt instead like a woman who had just discovered the exact size of the fire she would need to learn how to fight, and precisely one choice remaining to her now that she had seen it clearly. She could close her eyes again and let the house keep its secrets, or she could learn, quickly and quietly, how to stand entirely on her own. Mr. Hob had kept the Hollowmere accounts for 31 years, serving through 2 dukes and 1 near bankruptcy, long buried in family memory before Linnea had ever arrived to learn of it. He was the only person besides Edmund who had ever held the complete ledgers in his own 2 hands. And Linnea understood the moment she learned this exactly why he had been dismissed so abruptly, 3 days before the humiliating dinner that had finally driven her to act. She had told Mrs. Pruitt only that she wished to visit the village dressmaker, and had ridden out alone on a small grey mare borrowed from the stables, the moor wind stinging colour into her cheeks the entire way, grateful for once that no one at Hollowmere thought to question where a quiet Duchess chose to spend an idle afternoon. She found him in the village of Esterfield itself, in a cottage smaller than her own father's parlour, his hands still faintly ink-stained from decades of careful columns, though no one paid him a single shilling for the habit any longer. He answered the door himself, an old man in a worn cardigan, and his face when he recognized her went through surprise, then caution, then something that looked very much like relief he had not allowed himself to feel in weeks. Lord Edmund told the Duke I'd been skimming from the accounts, Hob said once she was seated by his small fire, not bitterly, but with the flat exhaustion of a man who had long since stopped expecting fairness from a world that had never offered him much of it. His Grace believed him without question. Why would he not? Lord Edmund is family, and I'm only a man who counted his coins for 3 decades and asked one question too many. Did you skim anything at all, Mr. Hob? No, Your Grace. He looked at her directly then, the very first person at Hollowmere who had not flinched away from her eyes since that dinner 3 nights past. But I found something I should never have looked closely enough to notice, and I made the grave mistake of mentioning it gently to the wrong man, before I understood at all who that man truly was beneath his pleasant manners. He told her the rest in careful, frightened pieces over the next half hour, how Edmund had been quietly borrowing against estate land for nearly 2 years, always with documents bearing the Duke's own signature, signatures Hob had slowly begun to suspect, studying them late at night by candlelight, were not entirely the Duke's true hand at all. He had raised the question once, gently and respectfully, directly to Edmund himself. Within the week, he had been accused publicly of theft and removed from the only house he had faithfully served for 31 unbroken years. "Why did you not go to the Duke yourself, Mr. Hobb, the moment you were dismissed?" Linnea asked, watching the fire's low light move across his tired face. "Because, Your Grace, who do you imagine the Duke would believe? A steward already accused of theft, or the cousin he has trusted his entire life?" Hobb shook his head slowly. "I had no proof, only suspicion, and suspicion buys an old man nothing in this world. I went home, and I waited, and I told myself perhaps I was simply wrong." He looked up at her then, something fragile and hopeful flickering behind his tired eyes. "Are you telling me, Your Grace, that I was not wrong after all?" "I am telling you that I intend to find out for certain," Linnea said, "and that when I do, I will need a man who already understands every column in those books better than anyone else alive." Hobb studied her face for a long moment in the firelight, as though weighing whether a Duchess he had known for less than half a year deserved the small, fragile hope he felt stirring again in his chest after weeks of believing himself simply forgotten. 31 years, Your Grace," he said quietly. "I kept those books honestly through good harvests and bad ones, through the old Duke's illness and the young Duke's grief, and I never once thought I would need anyone to believe me over a vein by blood. I find I'm glad all the same that you are willing to try." As she left his cottage, the early evening light already failing over the moor, she thought she saw a rider pause at the crossroads behind her, watching a moment too long before turning his horse away toward Hollowmere. She told herself it was nothing. She did not entirely believe it. She rode the last stretch home faster than she normally would have dared on the uneven moor track, glancing twice over her shoulder at nothing she could clearly identify, her heart beating harder than the easy pace of the mare's hooves alone could explain. By the time the grey towers of Hollowmere rose out of the dusk ahead of her, she had half convinced herself she had imagined the whole thing, and the other half of her had already begun quietly rehearsing what she would say if Edmund asked directly where she had spent her afternoon. Linnea walked back toward Hollowmere through the lowering moor light, with Hobb's careful words settling into place beside the ledger pages she had already copied in secret. A picture was assembling itself now, slow and genuinely terrible, of a patient cousin draining an estate one careful signature at a time, certain that a grieving duke too proud to examine his own books too closely would never notice the bleeding until it was already far too late to matter to anyone. She thought, walking, of confronting Garrick directly and laying everything before him at once. Then she thought of the dinner, of his voice cracking the air like a whip across the table. "How dare you question me?" and understood with sudden and complete clarity that a man so quick to silence a simple question would never welcome an accusation against his own blood without proof solid enough to survive the full weight of his pride bearing down against it. So she decided, in the last mile home as the sky deepened toward true dark, that proof was exactly what she would patiently build, quietly, carefully, the very same way she had once left a second wooden horse on a grieving child's windowsill and simply waited, without demanding anything, for it to be trusted in its own good time. She would need allies the household itself could not touch or silence. She would need eyes inside London that Edmund did not already control through fear or favor. And she would need, she realized with a small, surprising flicker of resolve, warming her chest against the cold evening air, to become someone capable of moving confidently through rooms full of real power without anyone suspecting for a moment what she quietly carried inside her sleeve. The unremarkable bride from Esterfield, it seemed, had a great deal of careful, dangerous work ahead of her now. She thought of Wren's 2 wooden horses standing watch together on the windowsill, and of how trust in this house had always arrived quietly, one small offering at a time. Proof, she decided, would have to be built the very same way, patiently, privately, with no one watching closely enough to stop her before it was finished. She did not yet know how dangerous that patience would prove, nor how little time she truly had left before Edmund noticed exactly where she had been that afternoon. The Duke did not forbid her from attending the spring charity bazaar at Aldermore Palace, mostly because he had barely spoken more than a dozen words to her in the weeks following the dinner. Their conversations had shrunk down to bare logistics, meals, weather, Wren's lessons, exchanged across a distance that felt, on some mornings, wider and colder than the moor itself stretching beyond the windows. Linnea told herself she did not mind the silence. She told herself this with such determined, deliberate frequency that she very nearly believed it some days. The bazaar filled 3 grand halls of Aldermore Palace with silk stalls, painted porcelain, and the particular bright noise of London's wealthiest pretending charity was their primary motivation for attendance that afternoon. Sunlight fell through the tall arched windows in long gold bars across the marble floor, catching on jewelry and crystal until the entire room seemed to shimmer, and somewhere beneath the chatter, a small orchestra played something light and forgettable, the kind of music meant to be background rather than memory. The journey from Hollowmere had taken the better part of 2 days, and Linnea had spent much of it watching the moor give way slowly to hedgerows, then to the first grey rooftops of the city, feeling smaller with every mile that put distance between her and the only 2 people in that cold house who had ever made her feel welcome. Wren, and on his better days, Mrs. Pruitt. Before she even reached her own modest stall, Lady Cresswell, a thin, sharp-eyed woman who had attended the dinner 3 weeks past, intercepted her near the entrance with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Duchess, how brave of you to come to town at all after such an evening at your own table. I do hope His Grace is recovering his temper." She said it lightly, the way a woman drops a pin deliberately where she knows a bare foot will later find it. Linnea answered with nothing more than a polite incline of her head and walked on, refusing to give the woman the satisfaction of a reply worth repeating. She found her stall near the far wall, between a milliner's table and a display of pressed flowers arranged under glass, and set out her handkerchiefs with hands that did not shake, despite Lady Cresswell's parting words still echoing faintly in her ears. She told herself she had come for the orphan fund alone, and almost believed it, until the bright noise of the hall and the unfamiliar freedom of standing somewhere no one expected anything particular of her began, slowly, to loosen something tight in her chest that had been wound there since the night of the dinner. Linnea arrived with a small embroidered case of her own careful work, handkerchiefs mostly, stitched through long silent evenings at Hollowmere when sleep would not come easily, intending to sell them quietly for the orphan fund and disappear before anyone important noticed a duchess working her own market stall with her own 2 hands. She had not accounted at all for Prince Alaric Sundermere. The Queen's younger brother moved through the crowded bazaar the way certain rare people moved through every room they entered, not loudly, never seeking attention, but with a quiet gravity that bent the surrounding space around him without any visible effort at all. He stopped at her modest stall far longer than simple courtesy required, turning a single handkerchief over in his hands with genuine, unhurried interest that surprised her more than his title did. "Your own work, Duchess?" he asked, examining the careful stitching along one corner. "It passes the long evenings, Your Highness." She watched him turn the small square of linen over once more, half expecting him to set it down and move on the way most fashionable visitors did after a single polite remark, and found herself oddly pleased when he did not. "Most duchesses of my acquaintance would rather die outright than be caught stitching for an orphan fund stall with their own hands," he said, entirely without mockery, which surprised her further still. "It is genuinely refreshing. Most things performed at court are exactly that. Performances, nothing more. This is not one of them." He told her, almost in passing, that he funded the charity school partly because his own childhood at court had been a lonely, watched sort of existence. Every gesture studied for meaning by people who had decided long before he opened his mouth what kind of prince he ought to be. "Children who have never had anyone decide things for them," he said, "grow up rather better than children who have had nothing else. I am only trying, in my small way, to give a few of them that chance." It was an oddly unguarded thing for a prince to admit to a near stranger, and Linnea found herself liking him rather more for the admission than for anything he had said before it. They spoke for perhaps 10 unhurried minutes, about thread, about her small hometown of Esterfield, about the school again, which he mentioned almost reluctantly, as though faintly embarrassed by his own ordinary decency in a city that rewarded cruelty far more often than kindness. He asked her nothing at all about her marriage directly. He did not need to ask. Court gossip had already quietly supplied him the rough shape of that dinner weeks past. Nearly everyone fashionable in London now knew precisely how the Duke of Hollowmere had once spoken to his own wife at her own table. "Your husband is a fortunate man," Alaric said finally, setting the handkerchief down gently among the others. "I am not entirely certain he knows it yet, though I suspect he will in time, if he's half as sensible as his reputation suggests." He purchased 4 handkerchiefs outright for the orphan fund and walked on through the crowd, and Linnea stood very still for a long moment afterward, aware that something small but genuinely important had just happened between them. Not romance, nothing so simple or so dangerous as that, but recognition. A prince of the realm had looked directly at her and seen a person worth 10 careful, unhurried minutes of his attention in a city that had spent the better part of a month treating her as little more than Hollowmere's quiet, forgettable footnote of a bride. She gathered the remaining handkerchiefs into her case, her fingers steadier than they had been in weeks, and allowed herself, just for that one bright moment beneath the palace's high-painted ceiling, to feel something close to hope. She did not know yet that Edmund Vane had been watching the entire exchange from across the crowded hall, half hidden behind a pillar, his expression carefully blank. Nor did she know that he was already composing, in the patient and ruthless architecture of his own mind, exactly how he intended to use those 10 innocent minutes against her before the week was even finished. On the long carriage ride back to Hollowmere, Linnea found herself turning the prince's parting words over and over, not for any romantic weight in them, but because no one, not her father, not Garrick, not a single soul since her wedding day, had ever once told her that her husband was fortunate to have her. She had spent 5 months believing the arrangement ran entirely in the opposite direction, that she was the one who had been fortunate to be chosen at all. It was a small thing, a stranger's passing kindness at a market stall, and yet it sat in her chest the rest of the journey home like the first warm coal in a cold grate, small but undeniably, stubbornly alive. Rumours in London travelled the way damp travelled silently through old stone walls, invisible for days, until suddenly the entire structure was found ruined from the inside out. By the time Linnea's carriage finally reached Hollowmere again, the story had already outpaced her completely, arriving ahead of her through letters, calling cards, and the particular swiftness reserved only for gossip, too delicious for anyone to resist repeating. It had started, she would later piece together, in a drawing room, 2 quiet streets from the palace, with a single careless sentence dropped by a woman who had not even attended the bazaar herself that afternoon. I hear the Duchess of Hollowmere spent the better part of an hour alone with the Queen's own brother. By evening the story had grown a second sentence. By the following morning, a third, each one further from the simple truth of 10 minutes spent discussing thread and a quiet charity school. None of it bore any real resemblance to what had actually happened, but resemblance to truth had never once been a requirement for a story this delicious to London's idle drawing rooms. Lady Cresswell, predictably, was among the first to carry it further. At a morning call Linnea had not wished to attend but could not politely refuse. The woman leaned close over the tea service and said, smiling, "I do hope the Prince's school is a generous one, Duchess. One hears he is rather fond of generous causes these days." The other ladies in the room laughed softly behind their cups, and Linnea sat through the rest of the call with her spine perfectly straight and her hands perfectly still, refusing to give any one of them the satisfaction of watching her flinch. She left that call understanding, with a clarity that settled cold in her stomach, that the rumor had already done its work regardless of what she said or did not say in defense of herself. A woman accused in a drawing room was rarely acquitted by anything so simple as the truth. She was acquitted, if at all, only when something larger and more interesting came along to replace the story entirely. Linnea did not yet know what that larger story would be. She only knew, riding home in silence, that she intended to be the one who supplied it. Edmund arrived at Hollowmere 2 full days later, wearing an expression of carefully manufactured concern, the kind that fit his face the way a borrowed coat fits a thief. Almost convincingly, provided no one looked too closely at the seams stitched hastily around it. "You should know what is already being said, cousin," he told Garrick quietly in the study, where Linnea was not present, but later heard every careful word repeated second-hand by an uneasy footman who could not quite bring himself to stay silent about it any longer. "I would not have mentioned it at all, but I thought you would rather hear it first from family than from some stranger at your own club." Garrick said nothing for a very long moment, his jaw tight. "Say it plainly, Edmund. I have no patience left tonight for your careful preambles." "They are saying your wife danced rather longer than was wise with Prince Alaric at the palace, that she sought him out quite deliberately, that perhaps a woman married purely for convenience finds her satisfactions elsewhere entirely, when her own marriage offers so very little real warmth to begin with. Edmund let the heavy silence afterward do the remainder of his careful work for him, watching his cousin's face for the exact moment the poison finally took hold beneath the skin. "You sound almost pleased to be the one delivering it," Garrick said slowly, studying him. "I'm only ever pleased to spare you the indignity of hearing it first from strangers, cousin," Edmund replied smoothly, and the lie sat so comfortably in his mouth that Garrick, still grieving and still proud, and still entirely unsuspecting of the man across from him, didn't think to question it even once. That night, for the first time in 5 long weeks, the Duke came to her chambers. He didn't raise his voice at all. He did not need to. Linnea had learned by now that his quietest, most carefully measured moments carried far more weight than his loudest ever could. "Did you dance with him?" he asked, standing just inside her doorway, his face unreadable in the low candlelight. "No," Linnea answered evenly. "We spoke for perhaps 10 minutes about handkerchiefs and an orphan school he funds quietly outside London. I did not seek him out, Garrick. He approached my modest stall exactly as he likely approached a dozen others that same crowded afternoon. That is not at all what is currently being repeated in every fashionable drawing room across London." "No," she agreed steadily, holding his gaze without flinching. "It is not. I cannot control what London chooses to say about me, Garrick. I can only tell you plainly what truly happened and trust you finally to decide for yourself whether 5 months of knowing me has taught you anything real at all about the kind of woman I actually am. You went to him with private estate matters before you ever came to me," he said quietly, and for the first time she heard something underneath the accusation that sounded almost like hurt rather than anger. "Whatever else is true or false in what they are saying, that much I already know, because Hobbs' name appears in my own household ledger of recent visitors, and you never once mentioned it to me yourself." "I didn't come to you," Linnea said, "because the last time I asked you a single question at your own table, you told the entire room I had no right to ask it. I'm not seeking the prince's favor, Garrick. I'm trying to protect this family from something I am not yet able to prove, and I did not believe until very recently that you would believe me even if I could." He looked at her for a long, searching moment, something genuinely unreadable moving behind his dark and tired eyes, and then he left without answering her at all, his footsteps fading slowly down the cold corridor. Linnea sat alone afterward in the guttering candlelight, understanding with a cold and sudden clarity exactly what kind of careful trap Edmund had constructed around them both, and precisely whose fragile, struggling marriage it had always been quietly designed from the very start to destroy completely. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window instead, watching the moor turn from black to grey to the faint pink of early dawn, and made herself a quiet promise that whatever else came of this, she would not let a lie convince her husband of something a single honest conversation could have settled in minutes, if only he had thought to have it with her instead of with his cousin first. By morning, she had decided something else as well. She would no longer wait for Garrick to ask the right questions on his own. She would simply make certain, as quietly and patiently as she had built every other small piece of this fight, that the answers were already waiting for him the moment he finally did. The fever came for Wren on a Tuesday, fast and frightening, the way illness moves through small children without any warning at all. Perfectly fine at breakfast, burning hot and frightened by supper, the nursery smelled of vinegar and tallow candles by midnight. The fire built high against the chill, though the child herself burned hotter than the flames beside her, and Linnea sat through the entire night beside the child's narrow bed with cool, damp cloths and the same quiet songs her own mother had once sung softly to her, while the household physician muttered grim, uncertain words in the corridor that he wrongly assumed Linnea could not hear clearly through the heavy door between them. Garrick arrived past midnight, urgently summoned from London, where he had gone, ostensibly, on pressing estate business, though Linnea privately suspected, without any real proof at all, that the sudden trip had been partly an escape from a house that had grown far too complicated and painful for him to stand inside any longer. He stood frozen in the doorway, still wearing his heavy travelling coat, and watched his wife press a damp cloth gently to his daughter's burning forehead with a tenderness that no cruel drawing-room rumour could ever have manufactured convincingly. He didn't speak for a long moment, his travelling gloves still clenched in one hand, his eyes moving from his daughter's flushed face to his wife's steady, exhausted one, and back again, as though only now, in the worst possible hour, fully understanding how much of the last 5 weeks he had spent looking the wrong way entirely. "She asked for you before the fever finally took her words away entirely," Linnea said quietly, not looking up from the small flushed face beneath her hands. "She asked if her mother—" Linnea hesitated for just a moment, choosing the next word with enormous care. "If I would stay beside her through the night." Something in Garrick's carved, carefully guarded face cracked open, just slightly, just enough for Linnea to glimpse the frightened man hiding underneath all that practiced armor for the very first time since their quiet wedding day. He crossed the small room without a single word and took his daughter's tiny hand gently in both of his own. They kept silent vigil together until the grey light of dawn finally broke across the moor outside. Two people who had barely managed a single kind sentence between them in weeks, now united completely by nothing more complicated than shared fear for the same small, fragile girl. Somewhere near 3 in the morning, with Wren finally drifting into a restless, fever-thinned sleep, Garrick spoke without lifting his eyes from his daughter's face. "Margaret used to sing to her before the fevers came, when she was still a baby. A foolish little tune about a fox and a hedge. I never learned the words. I assumed there would always be time to ask her to teach me." His voice caught, just barely, on the last word. "There's a great deal I assumed I would have time for." He had never once spoken Margaret's name aloud to her before, not in 5 months of marriage, and Linnea understood, sitting very still beside him, that whatever he said next mattered far more than anything she might say in reply. She kept her hands quiet in her lap and waited, the way she had once waited for a frightened 6-year-old to trust a second wooden horse, and let the silence belong entirely to him for as long as he needed it. Linnea said nothing for a long moment, letting the confessions settle in the quiet room rather than rushing to fill it. Then, softly, she began to hum a different tune entirely, one her own mother had sung to her in another small house many years before, and Wren, even in her fevered sleep, seemed to settle slightly toward the sound of it. Garrick watched her do this with an expression she could not quite name, something between grief and gratitude, and did not look away again for a long while. The fever finally broke an hour after sunrise. Wren slowly opened her tired eyes, found both of them still sitting there beside her, and said the only thing a frightened 6-year-old truly needed to say in that exhausted moment: "You stayed. Both of you stayed all night." "Both of us," Garrick said softly, and his voice, for the very first time Linnea had ever heard it in 5 long months, was not careful or guarded at all. Later, standing together in the quiet corridor outside the nursery, exhausted and raw in the particular way only a long, fearful night can leave two people feeling, Garrick finally said the difficult thing he had been completely unable to say aloud for 5 entire weeks. "I should never have believed the very worst of you so quickly, without even asking you directly first." He paused, rubbing his tired eyes. "I have spent 5 long years building walls so impossibly high around myself that I genuinely stopped being able to tell the real difference between protecting myself from pain and simply punishing everyone who ever tried hard to reach me." "I'm not trying to take her place," Linnea said softly, watching his face carefully. "I never once was, Garrick. I only wanted a small place of my own." "I understand that fully now," he admitted. "I'm only deeply sorry it took my own daughter's frightening fever to finally teach me something your quiet, patient kindness had been gently trying to show me for months already." He looked down at his daughter's sleeping face, then back at his wife. "Margaret's very last words to me were that I would never again let anyone close enough to risk losing them the way I lost her. She was entirely right about that. I made absolutely certain of it for 5 long years, and very nearly lost something else precious in the process without ever noticing." "Grief asked something of you that was never fair to ask," Linnea said gently. "But you are not the only one who has been frightened in this house, Garrick. I have been frightened nearly every day since I arrived, of saying the wrong thing, of caring too openly for a child who was not mine to claim, of loving a man who had made it very plain he did not wish to be loved at all." She paused, surprised by her own honesty. "I said it anyway in the end. I think I had simply stopped being able to help it." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind his tired eyes, and reached for her hand without quite seeming to decide to do it. It was not complete forgiveness yet, not entirely or all at once. But it was the very first true door Hollowmere Hall had genuinely opened to her since the terrible night the soup had gone cold, and Linnea walked carefully through it now, fully aware that doors opened wide in sudden fear, sometimes closed again just as quickly once that fear had safely passed, and that Edmund Vane remained out there somewhere even now, patiently waiting for exactly that kind of small crack to widen further still. Hobbs' quiet warning about signatures that were not quite the Duke's own true hand had stayed with Linnea for weeks afterward, a small splinter beneath the skin she simply could not stop touching, no matter how she tried to distract herself with other household matters. The reconciliation in the nursery corridor had given her something she had not had before, a husband willing, at last, to listen rather than simply rule, but she understood that trust freshly rebuilt was also fragile, and that one more unproven accusation against his own cousin could undo weeks of careful healing in a single sentence. With Garrick finally softened toward her, though not yet fully trusting again, she understood clearly that a simple accusation alone would never be enough on its own. She needed the actual forgery itself, proven completely beyond any reasonable argument, placed directly and undeniably in front of him. She wrote carefully to Prince Alaric, formally, addressing the letter discreetly to his charity school rather than to him personally, a small precaution she was not entirely certain she truly needed, but took anyway out of careful instinct. She asked in the plainest and most direct terms she could manage to put to paper, whether he happened to know of any expert document examiner in London capable of studying a disputed signature with absolute and complete discretion. His reply arrived within 3 short days, brief and entirely free of any judgment at all about the damaging rumors that had so nearly destroyed her reputation a fortnight before. He recommended a careful man named Aldous Ferris, a document examiner who had testified credibly in Chancery court cases for over 20 years, and added a single quiet line at the very bottom that Linnea read 3 full times before carefully folding the letter away into her sleeve. "Whatever it is you are quietly building, Duchess, I sincerely hope it is something that finally lets that entire house breathe freely again." She travelled down to London under the simple cover of a shopping excursion with only Mrs. Pruitt as her loyal companion, and sat across a narrow desk from Aldous Ferris in his cramped office, smelling strongly of ink and old paper, while he carefully examined the 3 pages she had copied from the hidden ledger against a genuine sample of the Duke's true signature she had quietly obtained from an old letter found in the Hollowmere library shelves. Mrs. Pruitt had said little during the long carriage ride, but as they waited in Ferris's outer office, she finally spoke. "I have served 3 duchesses at Hollowmere, Your Grace, counting yourself. None of the others would have walked into a stranger's office in London to fight for that house the way you are fighting for it now." She did not elaborate further, but Linnea understood, in the careful way the older woman patted her gloved hand once before falling silent again, that it had been meant as the highest compliment Mrs. Pruitt knew how to give. Linnea found, sitting in that narrow waiting room with the city noise rising faintly through the window, that she was no longer entirely the woman who had climbed into a carriage 8 months before, believing herself fortunate simply to have been chosen at all. She had learned, somewhere between a wooden horse on a windowsill and a forged signature behind a portrait, that being chosen and being valued were not always the same thing, and that the second one, it turned out, was something she would have to build for herself rather than wait politely to be given. "These are simply not the same hand at all," Ferris said within 20 careful minutes, with the flat professional certainty of a man who had spent his entire working life noticing exactly these kinds of small differences. "Close, admittedly, even rather skilled in places, but the pressure along the downstrokes is consistently wrong, and whoever forged this clearly signed in some haste each time, here and again here." He pointed precisely with one ink-stained finger. "I would testify confidently to this finding in any court of law in all of England, without the slightest hesitation." Linnea returned home to Hollowmere with the completed written examination folded carefully inside her glove. 3 full pages of solid proof that Edmund Vane had been quietly forging his own cousin's name onto debt after debt for nearly 2 entire years, steadily draining an estate the Duke had only ever believed was simply struggling through bad luck, never once suspecting it was actively bleeding to death beneath a deeply trusted relative's careful, patient hand. She found Garrick alone in his study that same evening, and for the very first time since the terrible night the soup had gone cold, she sat down calmly across from him, entirely unasked, and placed the formal examination flat on the desk, squarely between them. "I need you to read every word of this before you say anything at all," she said firmly, meeting his eyes directly. "And I need you to remember clearly, before you even finish reading it, that I am most certainly not the one in this house who has been lying to you." He read through it in complete silence, his face changing visibly through 3 distinct stages as she watched closely. Confusion first, then disbelief, then finally something far colder and infinitely more dangerous settling firmly behind his tired eyes. The particular dreadful stillness of a man slowly realizing exactly how thoroughly he had been deceived by someone who shared his own blood and had sat at his own table for years. "He sat across from me at this very desk, not 3 weeks ago," Garrick said quietly, more to himself than to her, "and told me the Northern Fields debt was simply bad luck, the kind every estate suffers eventually. I thanked him for his honesty. I actually thanked him." He pressed his palm flat against the desk, as though to steady himself against something only he could feel, moving beneath it. 5 years, Linnea. 5 years I let him manage what I could not bear to look at closely myself. Because looking closely at anything since Margaret died has felt like opening a wound I was not certain would ever stop bleeding once it started again. "You are looking at it now," Linnea said gently. "That is the only part that matters going forward." "Edmund," he said at last, and it was not posed as a question at all. "Edmund," Linnea confirmed quietly, watching him carefully. "And I firmly believe he's about to discover very soon now that I already know it completely." Garrick sat back slowly in his chair, the candlelight catching the grey beginning at his temples, and for a long moment said nothing at all, simply turning the 3 pages over in his hands as though weighing, in that silence, every year he had trusted the wrong man without once thinking to question it. "I will need to decide carefully how this is handled," he said finally. "Not for his sake, for Wren's. She has already lost one parent to grief she did not choose. I will not let her lose her father's good name to a scandal of my own making, when there is a quieter, surer way to see justice done." Edmund discovered the truth far faster than either of them had reasonably expected. A maid loyal to him, paid quietly for her loyalty, as Linnea would only later learn, had spotted Hobbs' name carelessly entered in the household ledger of recent visitors and reported it back to him within the very same hour. He had spent the following 2 days in a state of careful, controlled panic, reviewing in his own mind every document he had ever forged, calculating exactly how much could still be salvaged if he moved decisively enough, and concluding, by the second night, that decisive movement now meant attacking before he could be cornered. By the time Linnea and Garrick descended together for the Queen's grand summer ball at Aldermore Palace 3 nights later, Edmund Vane had already decided with cold and ruthless clarity that his only remaining path forward was to finish completely what the drawing room rumours had merely started before those damning forged signatures could finish him first. The great ballroom blazed brightly with 1,000 candles, reflected endlessly in mirrors, taller than the footman who carefully polished them each morning. Linnea wore deep blue silk that Garrick himself had personally chosen for her that very afternoon, the very first true gift he'd given her since their quiet wedding day, and when he led her confidently onto the dance floor for the opening set, the entire room noticed at once, the same fashionable room that had spent a full fortnight whispering eagerly about her supposed indiscretion, now watched instead a duke who could not seem to look away from his own wife for even a single moment. Lady Cresswell watched from the edge of the floor with an expression that had curdled somewhat since the morning call weeks before, clearly displeased to see the scandal she had so enjoyed circulating now apparently disproving itself in front of 200 witnesses. Linnea caught her eye once across the room and offered nothing more than a small polite nod, the same nod she might have given any other guest, and found, to her quiet satisfaction, that it cost her nothing at all to do so. It was during the second set, while Garrick spoke briefly across the room with the Queen's own steward, that Edmund finally made his calculated move. He crossed the polished floor directly toward Linnea and spoke low enough that only she alone could possibly hear him over the music. "You genuinely believe a forged signature and one frightened old steward will somehow save you now," he said, smiling pleasantly for the benefit of anyone watching closely. I have spent 2 full careful years quietly building a story all of London already firmly believes. That you are merely an unremarkable bride who reached far above her station, first for a title, then for a prince. Produce your precious proof, and I will simply produce something far more convincing in its place. Garrick's pride will never survive a second public scandal. I know him far better than you ever possibly will. Then you have made a truly serious miscalculation tonight, Lord Edmund, said a calm, unhurried voice directly behind them both. The voice carried easily over the music, calm enough that several heads nearby turned at once, drawn by the particular stillness in it rather than its volume, the same quality Linnea had noticed in Garrick's own quietest, most dangerous moments months before. Prince Alaric Sandomir had crossed the crowded ballroom without either of them once noticing his approach, and his expression, Linnea saw immediately, held none of its usual warmth or gentleness at all. I have personally read Mr. Ferris's written examination myself, at the Duchess's own request, well before tonight's ball. I have also spoken at length this very evening with the Queen's own solicitor about a cousin forging a duke's signature against crown-adjacent estate land. That is most certainly not merely a private family disgrace, Lord Edmund. That is a serious matter for the criminal courts. Edmund's careful composure did not break entirely all at once, but something underneath it visibly shifted, the very first true crack Linnea had ever witnessed in his patient architecture. This remains a private family matter entirely. It stopped being private, Alaric said firmly. The precise moment you forged a man's name in order to steal his own land, and it stops being yours to quietly manage the moment the Duke himself fully learns of it. He gestured calmly toward the crowd, and Linnea turned to find Garrick already standing close behind them, close enough to have clearly heard every last word, his face gone the color of cold grey ash. 2 full years, Edmund, Garrick said quietly, his voice dangerously even. 2 years of signatures I genuinely never made, debts I never once approved, and you simply let me believe the entire time that I was failing my own house through nothing more than bad luck and careless management. His voice did not rise even slightly. It did not need to. The terrible stillness within it was somehow far worse than the shout that had once cruelly broken Linnea's dinner table months before. "How dare you?" he said, and this time the burning words were not aimed at his wife at all. "How dare you do this to my own family, and let me blame only myself for it every single day?" "I did it for this family," Edmund said suddenly, his careful mask finally slipping entirely, his voice rising for the first time that evening. "Someone had to manage what you were too buried in your own grief to manage yourself. I would have made it right eventually, once the timber sale." "You would have made yourself the Duke eventually," Garrick cut in, "once there was nothing left of me to forgive you for." The 2 men stared at each other across a gulf. Neither of them could pretend any longer was merely family disagreement. The watching ballroom around them had slowly begun to notice the particular hush of 200 fashionable people pretending studiously not to listen while listening entirely and completely. Edmund glanced once toward the gathering crowd at the edges of the dance floor, rapidly calculating, as he always carefully did, whether any version of this unraveling story still remained within his control to manage. For one brief, dangerous moment, his hand moved toward the inside of his coat, and Linnea felt her breath catch, uncertain what he intended. But it was only a folded paper he drew out, the original mortgage document itself, perhaps meant as a final, desperate bargaining piece. Alaric stepped forward smoothly and took it from his hand before Edmund had fully decided what to do with it. "This will be wanted by the court," the prince said simply, "and you will find it far easier to hand it over now, in front of witnesses, than to be searched for it later in front of considerably less forgiving company." Edmund's eyes moved once around the ring of watching faces, searching, Linnea understood, for a single ally in the entire glittering room. He found none. Even the friends who had laughed easily at his jokes over wine for years now studied the floor, the chandeliers, anywhere but his face, the particular swift cowardice of fashionable people abandoning a man the moment his usefulness to their own gossip had run out. There was none left. 2 footmen, summoned quietly moments before by the Queen's own solicitor, were already moving steadily across the gleaming marble floor directly toward him. Lord Edmund Vane was quietly escorted from Aldermore Palace before the 3rd dance set had even properly begun, and within the following month, Formal charges of forgery and serious fraud against the entire Hollowmere estate were officially filed in Chancery Court, built carefully upon Aldous Ferris's professional examination and the testimony of a steward named Hobb, whose 31 years of completely honest service were, at long last, publicly and entirely vindicated before the whole county. The trial itself lasted only 3 days, far shorter than Linnea had feared, since Edmund's solicitor advised him quietly, once the full weight of the evidence had been laid out before the court, that contesting it further would only lengthen his sentence rather than soften it. He was found guilty of forgery and fraud against the estate, stripped of his standing as heir presumptive, and ordered to repay what remained recoverable of what he had taken, though everyone in the courtroom understood that some debts, once incurred, could never be fully repaid in coin alone. Garrick personally restored Hobb to his old position before the trial had even fully concluded, and the elderly steward wept openly in the very same study where he had once been falsely accused. Surrounded once again by the same careful ledgers he had always kept with scrupulous, unrewarded honesty for 3 full decades. "I had stopped believing anyone in this house would ever ask the right questions, Your Grace," Hobb told them both, his voice unsteady. "I am glad, more than I can properly say, that I was wrong to stop hoping." The debt itself proved real, though considerably smaller than Edmund's careful forgeries had deliberately made it appear, and with the Northern Fields' true rightful ownership fully restored, and the false mortgages formally voided by court order, Hollowmere Hall slowly began, week by week, to genuinely breathe again, very much like the house Prince Alaric had quietly hoped it might someday become, when he had written that single careful line in a letter weeks before any of this had finally come to light. London's fashionable drawing rooms, predictably enough, soon found an entirely new story to eagerly tell one another. This particular one, at least, happened to be completely true. A Duchess once carelessly dismissed as thoroughly unremarkable had quietly uncovered a calculated forgery that a dozen trained lawyers and accountants had somehow missed for 2 entire years, and had accomplished it not through shouting or public scandal, but through sheer patience, careful copying, and the simple courage to keep walking steadily toward proof even when the man she deeply loved had once told her, in front of an entire table of guests, that she had no right whatsoever to question him at all. Garrick found her quietly in the morning room some peaceful weeks later, carefully arranging fresh flowers in exactly the same way she had been arranging them on the very first day she had nervously arrived at Hollowmere, when little Wren had watched her silently from the doorway, clutching a small wooden horse missing one ear. "I owe you an apology far larger than any I genuinely know how to give you properly," he said quietly, standing in the doorway. "Not only for that terrible night at the table, for every single night afterward that I allowed my own foolish pride to matter more than your patient, quiet faith in me." "You already gave me the apology that truly mattered most," Linnea said gently, setting down her shears. "The night you stayed faithfully beside Wren's bed and called us both her mothers in the very same breath, without even fully noticing you had said it at all." He crossed the quiet room and took both her hands gently in his own, the simple gesture itself entirely ordinary, yet the deep meaning behind it now completely new between them. "I built walls so impossibly high around myself that I very nearly lost everything precious inside them while trying desperately to protect it. You never once raised your voice at me, not a single time, and yet you tore down far more of Edmund's careful lies than I managed to notice in 5 long years of deliberately looking the other way." He paused, his voice softening further. "I do not honestly deserve the patience you so freely gave this entire house. But I am asking you now, properly this time, if you might consider continuing to give it anyway, for as long as you'll have me." "I never once stopped giving it," Linnea said simply, smiling now. "I only finally stopped waiting for anyone's permission to become more than merely quiet." He bent and kissed her then, gently, in the ordinary daylight of the morning room, with the flowers still scattered across the table between them, and it was nothing at all like the careful, assessing glance he had given her twice at their wedding 8 months before. It was the first time, Linnea realized, that he had ever looked at her as though he had genuinely chosen her, rather than simply accepted what arithmetic and his mother's quiet insistence had arranged for him. Outside the tall windows, Wren ran happily across the wide lawn with both small wooden horses clutched tightly against her chest, calling loudly for them both to come watch her race. the wind down toward the old grey stone wall, and for the first time since Margaret's quiet portrait, had first watched a frightened new bride climb these very stairs entirely alone. Hollowmere Hall rang warmly with something that had been completely missing from its cold halls for 5 long, difficult years. Laughter. Unguarded laughter, entirely unafraid of anything at all. Months later, at a far smaller and quieter gathering than the grand ball that had nearly destroyed her completely, Linnea danced once again, not with any prince this time, but with her own husband, wearing the very same blue silk he had so carefully chosen for her once before, while across the warm room, Prince Alaric Sundermere quietly raised his glass to a difficult story that had finally ended exactly the way simple decency had always demanded it should, and Hob, fully restored now to his beloved ledgers and his hard-earned dignity, watched the Duke and Duchess of Hollowmere together with the quiet, deep satisfaction of a man who had always privately known, long before anyone else at Hollowmere ever dared to say it aloud, that the so-called unremarkable bride from Esterfield had never once, not for a single day, truly been ordinary at all. Wren, old enough now to stay a little later at family gatherings, sat on a low stool near the musicians with both wooden horses arranged carefully on her lap, watching her father and the woman she had quietly, privately begun calling Mother Turn slowly together beneath the candlelight. She did not say the word aloud that night. She would, eventually, on an ordinary Tuesday months later, with no ceremony at all, simply look up from her supper and use it as though she had always used it, and Linnea would have to set down her own spoon for a moment before she trusted her voice enough to answer. She had simply been quietly waiting all along for the world around her to finally ask the right questions, and had proven brave enough, when absolutely no one else would, to courageously ask them herself, one patient and unremarkable day at a time, until an entire house, and the broken man inside it, had finally learned how to come home to her.